Chapter 10, Part 10, Everyone is Going Solo. It was 1970, and they were no longer a band, but they were still musicians and still famous. Paul wanted to spend time with his family. He and his wife Linda, whom he married in 1969, bought a farm in Scotland. They had 3 children. One daughter, Stella, grew up to be a famous fashion designer. Paul made a solo album called McCartney. He played every instrument himself, including guitar, drums, and piano. Soon he started another band called Wings and played concerts again, which he had always loved. Paul taught Linda, who was a photographer, how to play the keyboard for his band. That way, they would never have to be apart. George and Ringo were also busy making music. Paul and John had always been the lead songwriters in the Beatles. George and Ringo weren't allowed to sing much. Now they could make their own albums. George had so many songs saved up that when he recorded his album, it was longer than any of the ones released by the Beatles. In 1971, with his song My Sweet Lord, he became the first Beatle to have a #1 hit as a solo artist. George also cared a lot about helping people in need. Once he organized a giant concert to raise money for starving children in Bangladesh. He also produced movies including Monty Python's Life of Brian. One thing about George never changed. No matter how famous he was still shy. Even after all the tours, he was afraid to go on stage. He always had to be coaxed into playing publicly. He eventually bought a 100-room mansion in England with his second wife Olivia and their son Danny. A tall fence around it gave the family some privacy. It didn't always keep out strangers, though. In 1999, a man broke into their mansion. George was stabbed, but he recovered and the man was arrested. Ringo wasn't as successful a musician as George. Still, he loved being famous because it meant people would always laugh at his jokes, invite him to parties, and ask him to play concerts. He never liked arguing with his bandmates. Now he was happy to be at peace again. Ringo didn't have a good singing voice. His speaking voice, though, was very entertaining, particularly for younger fans. Ringo narrated a popular children's television show, Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends, and played Mr. Conductor on Shining Time Station. And that was in season 1. In 1973 and 1974, Ringo had #1 hits with Photograph and You're 16. He formed the All-Star Band, which continues to tour. In 2010, the year he turned 70, Ringo came out with a new album called Why Not? John was probably the most glad to be free of the Beatles. Now he could say whatever he wanted about politics. He and Yoko visited the United States often. John spoke out against the Vietnam War, and people listened. He recorded a beautiful anti-war song called "Give Peace a Chance." He and Yoko held many protests where they explained why they thought the war should end. Instead of a large gathering of people, they had a bed-in. They wore pajamas and stayed in bed for 8 days as a protest. John and Yoko also rented big billboards that said, "War is over if you want it." The American government wasn't happy about this. One senator from South Carolina, Strom Thurmond, wanted John kicked out of the country. The FBI started to follow John around, watching everything he did. Did John run back to England? No. He and Yoko moved permanently to the United States in 1971. They bought an apartment in the Dakota, a famous building in New York City. They would live there the rest of John's life. So as John, Paul, George, and Ringo lived their lives apart from one another, one big question remained: when would the Beatles get back together? Never was the answer, John said. Some of them did work together, but never all four at the same time. George played with John and Ringo on their albums. Ringo played on John's, on Paul's, and on George's albums. Paul played on George's and on Ringo's albums, and John played on George's and on Ringo's albums. Why didn't the group ever have a reunion? Mainly because John and Paul were too mad at each other. In fact, after the Beatles broke up, John and Paul said hurtful things about each other in public. John even made fun of Paul's new music in the song "How Do You Sleep?" In 1972, 2 years after the breakup, John and Paul started talking again. And there was one night that they almost performed. It was in 1975 on a Saturday night when Paul happened to be in New York City. He went over to John's apartment and they watched some TV. The comedy show Saturday Night Live was on. Strangely, that night, the show's producers offered to pay the Beatles $1,000 if they would reunite for the program. It was a joke. People in the audience laughed because the Beatles had already been offered more than $1 million to play together again. Paul and John thought it would be funny to show up at the television studio and surprise everyone. In the end, they stayed in John's apartment, but fans still talk about what it would have been like had they sung together one more time.